Okay guys, Jonathan put out some questions out there that you guys wanted answered. So this week I wanted to talk to you about how to choose the correct arrow spine for your bow setup and how do you know what is optimal. So, you know, one of the biggest things that we look at with that is honestly manufacturer's chart. So we look at, you know, your draw length, your arrow cut length, and your poundage. And a lot of manufacturers have some good charts on their websites you can pull up and look at and get you really, really close to that. So I usually recommend to start based off of a manufacturer's recommendation arrow spine for your bow setup. And then as far as getting the arrows cut, this can change a little bit of what we call the dynamic spine of an arrow. So typically an arrow that's a little bit longer in length is going to react a little bit weaker, have a little more flex and bend. And the shorter you cut down an arrow, the stiffer the arrow is going to act dynamically out of the bow. So you know, for me, I do like to cut my arrows pretty short. If you look at a lot of these new arrows I'm shooting, especially like this new HLR from Victory here, I have got this cut to where from where my arrow shaft sits on the launcher of my arrow rest, I probably only have about a ½ inch of clearance or gap from the back of where my collar of this insert sits to the launcher. So I do like to cut my arrows a touch on the short side. From most guys don't like, which that's kind of a personal preference. And then once I've got that arrow cut length where I feel comfortable with it, if I still need to play with my bow's draw length a ½ inch, you know, shorter or longer, I have still a little bit of wiggle room, which is totally fine. And then at that point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a good paper tune. And paper tune is a great starting point to see how that bow is delivering the arrow. If I need to make any shims or, you know, tuning adjustments to the bow to get that arrow delivery perfect. And then the next step from there that you guys can do as kind of some next level tuning is bare shaft tuning. And what bare shaft tuning is literally taking an arrow with no fletchings. I'm going to have it, you know, it's going to be cut. I'm going to have my point weight, everything's set up, and I'm going to shoot that arrow at 20 yards to see how it reacts out of the bow, where the arrow wants to kick a little bit to the right or a little bit to the left. For guys that want to get super technical with that, what you can do is take where your vanes are positioned on the arrow and figure out the total weight of your vanes. And you'll see a lot of guys, you'll see a lot of pros have this in their quiver. They're going to have an arrow with some electrical tape back here. And what they're doing is they're trying to put the electrical tape in the same positioning and the same weight as what their vanes are representing. Sometimes adding weight to the back of the arrow will make the arrow act a little stiffer. If you add weight to the front, you're going to make the arrow react a little weaker. So for guys who want to get into bare shaft tuning, that's another really high level form of tuning for compound archery. It is very difficult to do if you're not really consistent with how you break shots on target. That can be very challenging. But for guys that want to go from paper tuning to bare shaft tuning, if I shoot this bare shaft at a target and the arrow kicks to the right, that's usually a stiff arrow reaction. If the arrow kicks to the left, it's a weak arrow reaction. But how good these bows are nowadays with knock travel. So when you take a one of these newer generation compounds and you pull that arrow back, that arrow doesn't have a whole lot of rise or fall to it. It doesn't move a lot of vertical, and it has very little movement left or right or horizontal shifting. So if I can take this arrow and get this bare shaft to fly perfectly straight, I'll get it to group with all my arrows that have vanes on them at 20 yards is a good starting point. At that point, what I like to do is go to about 60 yards is a very comfortable range and distance for me. And as I'm shooting groups, what I like to do, and this is a very cheap, easy test for guys to figure out arrow spine out of their bow setup, is to play with different point weights. So a lot of times when guys are working on a new arrow build, we come in, you know, we set up a lot of equipment here. I'll send guys out the door with their arrows and they'll have 3 different point weights available to try. I send them with 100, a 125, and 150 grain point on the front that they can go shoot on the front of their arrow. And they're going at that point, they're going to see which one of those groups the best. If you put on a 150 grain point, the heaviest, and you notice that your groups are improving and getting tighter, what that's doing is it's optimally breaking down the spine of the shaft as it's coming out of the bow. And when you get the perfect spine, I do personally feel you can create some forgiveness out of your setup that way. Too stiff of an arrow can be bad. And the reason being is as you shoot too stiff of an arrow, instead of the arrow wanting to flex and bend as it comes out of the bow, the arrow is so stiff, the whole arrow wants to kind of shimmy left and right like this. So usually that's the reaction you're going to see out of too stiff of an arrow. Instead of flexing and bending, the whole arrow wants to push. If you get too weak of an arrow, the arrow will actually look like a wet noodle in flight. There's no grouping consistency. It's going to group downrange kind of like a shotgun. And that's typically when you know you got too weak of an arrow spine. And you know, nowadays with a lot of these new modern bows, for how much stored energy that they have in the bow system and how good the knock travel is, it is usually better to err slightly on the stiff side versus the weak side of an arrow shaft. But if you guys think you're close, you don't know quite if it's going to improve or not, fill tips are cheap, guys. Get 3 fill tips of 100, 3 125s, 3 150s, put them on the front of your arrow, go shoot some groups out to 60 yards or whatever comfortable range that you find yourself that you can shoot the best groups at. And if you notice that different points group different downrange, if the 100 grain point happens to group better, that means your arrow might be a little bit on the weak side and it wants less point weight up front. If you find that the 150s group better, that means you probably have a little bit too stiff of an arrow and you need to break the spine down. And at that point, if you feel like maybe your arrow's maybe too stiff, let's say you got too stiff of an arrow, the 150 shot the best, but you don't want that much arrow weight and because you're losing speed, then you can come in, get 3 arrows or 6 arrows, spine down. Instead of maybe shooting a 300 on like what I'm shooting, maybe you could try some 350s. It does take a little bit of money to figure that out because you are going to have to buy a couple of different arrow shafts if you're getting that technical with it. But sometimes just by changing point weight will tell you enough about your setup, create some more forgiveness, and hopefully improve your grouping downrange. So great question this week. Hopefully I covered everything that we kind of do as a good starting point. If you have any questions, comment down below. Me and Jonathan will go through, read those. Maybe we can answer them in the future, but that's a good starting point. Start with a good tuned bow, paper tune it. If you want to bare shaft tune it, and then go group it downrange, try some different point weights, and just see how that arrow is reacting dynamically out of the bow. So great question this week. We really appreciate the comments and feedback, and remember to get wild.